John McCullough came with his uncle, and they bought a small piece of property from John Forsyth, Gabriel Forsyth, excuse me, Gabriel Forsyth. And this was the property that Joseph Friend had given Gabriel Forsyth and his daughter, Sarah Ann Friend, as a wedding gift. And it was 25 acres of land. And it included a freshet, as they called it, which was a very strong spring that ran very fast in the early part of the year, and they could use it for their up and down sawmill. It was an up and down blade that was water powered, and they started his whole empire, as it were, there. After that, by about 1902, he started buying other lumber companies. He bought Lock Haven Lumber. He bought, of course, he owned Bear Creek Lumber. He bought Meadow Mountain Lumber, and there's one more that I can't think of. And he combined them all in the sense that he ran them all. There were 27 miles of track that extended from here to Swanton. And they logged all of the forest between here and there, along Bear Creek and along the Yock. That was the last holdout in Garrett County, were these places, because they were the most difficult to get to with the terrain. But they had some of the richest trees. They had huge white pines, eastern white pines, that were so big that when they cut them down, they'd have to break them into fours because they were too big to take on the wagons. They were 25 feet in diameter. He logged, as I said, up until 1912, and during this time, in 1902, he was elected as the first mayor by a group of citizens unanimously. So he was the first mayor, but only for a year. And as I said, in 1905, he bought the lumbering business. By 1912, the lumbering business was done. His father wrote in his memoirs that he never thought he'd live to see the day that there was a dearth of wood in Garrett County, but they did. So, selling off all the properties that he had of lumber rights and all of his railroads, except for the C&O Railroad out of Confluence, which he helped to get to town. That way he could get his coal to market, because he bought the Fike Friend mine on the banks of the Youghiogheny River, on the east banks of the Youghiogheny River, between here and what was the town of Kendall. And he had a mine that was, I believe, more than 16 levels high, and it basically goes completely under all of what we call Elder Hill. He had his coal business until he passed, and he passed very suddenly in 1931. In 1925, let's go back. In 1915, he was instrumental in having the first miners' relief organization in Garrett County for coal miners. He also was one of the commissioners that worked on the Hopemont project. He also was a commissioner for the building of the Garrett County Courthouse. And at the same time that the Garrett County Courthouse was being built between 1906 and 1908, he used the same types of bricks on his property to make it resemble the courthouse. And that was one of his little perks, I guess, is to be able to get the bricks, the same bricks. Maybe he even supplied the bricks. I have no idea. He had his coal business until he passed, and he passed very suddenly in 1931. In 1925, let's go back. In 1915, he was instrumental in having the first miners' relief organization in Garrett County for coal miners. He also was one of the commissioners that worked on the Hopemont project. He also was a commissioner for the building of the Garrett County Courthouse. And at the same time that the Garrett County Courthouse was being built between 1906 and 1908, he used the same types of bricks on his property to make it resemble the courthouse. And that was one of his little perks, I guess, is to have be able to get the bricks, the same bricks. Maybe he even supplied the bricks. I have no idea. But after his first house in Friendsville was the house that is presently being lived in by Jimmy Spears Jr. It was the Hamill house, and before that it was the Forsyth property. And before that, it was the Bear Creek Meeting House, supposedly. And it was 2 big open floors with a wraparound porch on both decks. And they would have church meetings of all different denominations and weddings and school functions there until the school was built in 1890, I believe. The elementary school was built. His coal mining business was big. It employed, as did his lumber business, hundreds of people in Friendsville. I believe it is the 1900 census that lists almost 800 men living and working in Friendsville. So there was quite an extensive lumber business. The coal mining business wasn't as many, but still many of the families, many generations, or at least several generations of people worked in the coal mine in the McCullough No. 1 mine. In 1925, the Army Corps of Engineers decided to build dams on the Yaak in order to prevent flooding in Pittsburgh. And they decided to dam in Confluence, build the Confluence Dam. By doing so, they would flood all the railway between here and Confluence that carried the B&O and the C&O tracks. So John McCullough filed suit, his family filed suit against the Army Corps of Engineers that it would destroy this town, it would destroy the business. They fought the Army Corps of Engineers well after he passed away. His family fought until 1947. And lost. They were fighting the B&O Railroad and the Army Corps of Engineers. So needless to say, the tracks were buried. In 1931, John McCullough, knowing the impending time was coming where there would be no way to get his coal to market, they tried to drive it out the old Selbysport Road, but even that needed areas to be replaced where they could get through. So he was arguing on February 5th, 1931, at the commissioner's office in the courthouse of Garrett County, that if a road was not built from the west end of the bridge in Friendsville to connect to Route 40, that Friendsville would surely die. And he stood up and he was very impassioned with his speaking, and he said to the men, "Gentlemen, I am finished," and collapsed. Died of a heart attack right there. So he definitely had a lot of feelings for the town. He was a member of the International Order of Odd Fellows, and he supported the churches. The Methodist Church over on Water Street has a huge stained glass window that was donated by the Odd Fellows, the International Order of Odd Fellows, and he was responsible for that. He and George Fox and Fred Fox, George Cobb, these men were all friends. They were all businessmen that decided that Friendsville, was the place. And so they came, they set up their business. John McCullough in 1920 decided to run for the Senate and won and represented 2 terms for the Maryland State Senate. And during that time, he also was instrumental in getting a road that led from the east end of our bridge to 219, so that it was called the Friendsville-Oakland Road. I believe it was Route 37. And it was completed in 1925, and it was a concrete slab road about 8 to 10 inches thick that was poured all the way to 219 up Bear Creek, so that there was access to 219 for lumber and coal. And it also provided a fast way for people to get to Oakland before they had to take the train and then take different transfers, or they had to take these very old roads that were not very passable until they could get to 219. The house that I live in is the house that he lived in at the time of his death, with his family and his wife. And it's a big, beautiful house. It's in very good condition for its age. It was originally built by Thomas Henry Cuppet. And he was a builder before the time of Fred G. Fox and George Cobb. And he built a lot of the same type of houses. And there were 3 identical ones in Friendsville. 2 of them are the Fike House, which is on the Walnut Street, and then my house were identical until they were changed later after they were upgraded in the 20s. There's supposed to be a ghost in our house, and so many people, including my daughter, have claimed to have seen him, a little boy about 8 or 9 years old. Somebody told me that was McCullough's son that died in the early part of 1900, around 1910 or 1909, somewhere in there. So it's always a possibility. You never can tell about these things. Stories from his obituary talk about the fact that he loved Christmas so much that every child in Friendsville had to receive a gift from him personally. Every student that graduated from high school received a gold coin from him personally. His great-grandson, John Walker Holman, donated the property that the elementary school sat on for many years, which is now Demery's Inflatables. But so his family, his son was Ray McCullough was the superintendent of schools for Garrett County. Most of his family served the people. They served as councilmen, as leaders. So it's been a long legacy, but yet there are very few McCulloughs left in the area. The name has pretty much died out. But his great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren of all different names live all around here. Some of them don't even know who he is, because it's been 3 generations since anyone's spoken of him. In Friendsville, he and Mr. Cobb built the Opera House so that his daughter, who was a pianist, she was trained at the Baltimore Institute of the Baltimore Symphony, trained with the Baltimore Symphony and at Juilliard. She would play a lot of the music in between the silent films. And her name is Iva McCullough Statler. And her husband was Jacob Earl Statler, excuse me. And they built the Opera House so that the culture could be brought to Friendsville. And so Friendsville was a hopping little place. I mean, it had restaurants, it had hotels, it had opera house, it had bars, of course. Friendsville was one of the biggest producers of Applejack brandy at one time, and that was under Christian Fike. He was the producer. And I read in the census that the taxes were something like $17.50 on 55 gallons of Applejack. So it was a profitable business for them, let's say that.